All right, we're live. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Career Chronicles podcast. I'm your host, Sloan Bartley, and so excited to be here with you on this Thursday or whatever day that you're watching the recording. I'm excited to be joined by Erica, and I will introduce her in a moment. But first, want to just introduce our sponsors for the Career Chronicles podcast. Spyglass Partners is a staffing firm specialized in IT, supply chain, and finance and accounting. And they handle both project-based and full-time needs on the hiring side of things. So if you need any help with staffing, reach out to them. And then I also want to highlight Merit Media, which is one of our partners that helps us with sort of back office things, putting our podcast on Apple Music and Spotify. So shout out to Merit Media as well. And as you know, if you have been following the podcast, the purpose of the podcast is to really highlight women and our experiences in the workplace. So that organizations may better recruit and retain us. And Erica and I are both very passionate about self-promotion as women, and we're going to specifically dive into self-promotion as women in tech. And so I'm excited to have Erica here. Erica, I want to read a quick bio to introduce you to everybody. Erica specializes in career coaching for high-achieving professionals from non-traditional backgrounds who feel stuck in their current professions. Her focus is on guiding these individuals through meaningful career transitions and empowering them to leverage their unique strengths and achieve new levels of success. And Erica, just to give, just a few more tidbits about your background. I know you've previously been in recruiting and DEI programs in recruiting as well. So we both come with this recruiting lens and how to help people level up their careers and make advancements. And you also personally broke into tech, so you can speak to that as well and what that experience is like. So thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, Sloan, thank you for having me. I'm so excited and looking forward to this conversation today.
Yeah, same. Well, tell everybody how we got connected.
Yes, so fun story. We both have a virtual connection, and her name is Claire. I used to work with her at Google. We were colleagues in recruiting, and so she reached out to me and said, hey, I am going through a lot of life stuff right now, and I have a friend of mine who is amazing and has this wonderful podcast. Would you be interested? And so naturally I said yes, especially after looking at your profile and just seeing the great work that you're doing. And
you flatter me.
Here we are. Yes.
I love it. Well, Claire and I are connected in an interesting way. My best friend from middle school and high school, she and Claire married brothers. So that's how they got connected. And so that's how Claire and I know each other. Claire and I didn't grow up friends or anything, but I'm, very close with this friend of mine and just have gotten to meet everyone in her family, which now includes her in-laws, which Claire would technically be like her brother-in-law's wife. So now I feel like I know Claire, and it's great to get to have my network expanded. And I'm glad that you're on here with us today. To kick us off, I know everybody's always wanting to hear these stories. Do you want to briefly share with us how you broke into tech? Because these stories are so helpful for people who are looking to make career pivots.
Absolutely. Yeah. And thank you for allowing me to share, my story.
Yeah.
So, real quick here, as far as past life, what I was doing before I broke into tech, I was working in restaurants. And so I got to a place in my career where after a big surgery that I had to take some time off of work. Realistically, they let me go because I was going to need too much time off of work is what happened. And at that point, after I was ready to go back to work, because after I needed about 6 months of healing, I couldn't find a job. So I landed in restaurant, and I started from the bottom, worked my way up server all the way up to overseeing multiple facilities as a catering director. But I got to a point in my career where I was like, all right, I need to decide what I'm doing, because this is just not it for me long term, because this was not my initial goal. But I found myself in a place kind of stuck because I had already been with the company for almost 5 years.
Yeah.
So, when you get into a space like that, where you've been with an organization or kind of in a field for an extended period of time, it's harder, to figure out how to make those pivots. And so I also didn't know what I didn't know, because I just, I didn't know what I wanted to do. So there was that aspect. But I started to kind of figure out, well, where do my skills and what I know, where could that translate well into? And so after, doing some exploration, and it took some time, I landed in like the HR and recruiting space. was kind of my initial, thought. But then I was like, okay, now how do I get in? Because I
Yeah.
hired-ish, in the restaurant industry, but recruiting where you're doing, the full cycle recruiting. So you're finding candidates or job seekers, I should say, you're having those phone interviews, you're working with hiring managers. Like I didn't do all of that stuff. So I was like, well, how do I break in when I don't know how, to do this? I haven't done it before. And a lot of companies, they want experience. And ultimately what ended up happening is I found my avenue through Indeed. And I went ahead and applied for the role, and I was able to sell my experience, and they took a chance on me. And so that was my big breakthrough.
And you were working for Indeed.
And
I think I saw that on your, I was like, not to be confused with applying to a job on Indeed. You actually were working for Indeed.
Yeah, I was working for Indeed. And so that I actually worked for a product area under Indeed called Indeed Hire. And what they do is they act as an extension of recruiting teams. And so they work with different companies and help companies hire. So I would work with hiring managers across different role profiles, across different industries. And it gave me a lot of experience, and I was very grateful for the opportunity. But that was my big break into, tech. And then from there going into big tech, because once I was in, I was then able to pivot, and my next move was to Google. So.
Yeah, just little old Google, if you guys have ever heard of them. But that's crazy that you were able to break into Indeed. And did you ever get to speak more candidly with the hiring managers that brought you in as to why they liked your profile and why they were willing to bring in someone with the transferable experience rather than the, carbon copy experience that so often hiring managers look for?
Yeah, the person that hired me, so honestly, they didn't hire me for the role I interviewed for. So I interviewed for a team lead position, and I didn't get that position. And so what they said was because I interviewed so well, they still wanted to have me on the team and brought me in as a full recruiter. But one of the key points was during the interview, what was emphasized was the fact that I was eager to learn. I was, my positive attitude, the fact that I could talk about how I have done the research, and essentially I was comparing to, based on knowing the job description, I was talking about how my skills, that I've used those skills. And while maybe I haven't used, that specific tool, so they said I was able to give clear examples of like how, I have kind of done the role, so to speak, but through my transferable skills. So that was the selling point, because they could see that I would be able to come in. And while I didn't know all of, what the role entailed, they knew I was going to be able to get myself up to speed very quickly, and that I would do what it took to get there. So that was the feedback that I received. And so that showed me just though how powerful, like how you show up in an interview, right, and how you speak to your experience really can be that like make or break moment sometimes.
Yeah. So how do you think self-promotion played a part in nailing that interview?
Yeah, self-promotion. So I think for me, the self-promotion piece was really like the self-advocacy piece, where I really had to, I got a little bit vulnerable, if I'm going to be very honest, and I talked about how even in a few aspects of my personal life, how I've always, excelled, and how I've kept fighting and kept, climbing. And so I was able to say, hey, while I know you're looking for this experience, and I can't remember how many, I think it was like maybe 4 years of experience of, full life cycle recruiting, whatever they're asking. I was like, I'm going to be that person that is going to exceed expectations. And
Which is kind of wild that you landed the job and you had not been a full cycle recruiter before. And they weren't looking for, because sometimes they do hire entry level sourcers and things like that, but this was not that. This was a full cycle, full desk recruiter.
Yeah.
Wow.
Literally, it's like, if you are looking for somebody who's going to walk in and is going to exceed expectations month over month, I am that person. I said, I will walk in, I will show you that the decision that you made was the right decision. Like,
and I'm assuming you had data points from your background of like, here's how I've exceeded expectations in my current role or my previous ones. Okay.
Yeah. And I talked about like how, in my case, because of recruiting, I had to work with a lot of different clients, in the sense of, for me, that was different companies, trying to go to different companies and let them know that we were available for catering services, and how I was funding events and so forth. And so I was talking about how I was knocking on doors, going
sales,
to saying, hey, I'm here. We're in the community here. come join us, try us out. And so I was able to speak to that experience. I was able to speak to how I was able to increase our catering sales. So showing them that I also had a lot of that drive to, you know, grow. And so I think those were some of the key components, like being able to your point, show how I excelled in my previous role and how that would be beneficial to them as well. So I think those were some of the key points that allowed them to see that, hey, we should give her a chance.
Yeah, for sure. And I know when we initially spoke, there was, you know, there's some other stories in your career of, where you had to do self-promotion to speak up about times you were passed over for an opportunity. Is that something that you feel comfortable sharing now? I know there's, I won't steal your thunder, but I know there's a story that you shared with me about being passed up for a bungee, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, well, so I didn't actually get passed up, but I had to advocate for it. That was
To get it. Okay.
Yeah. So,
Okay.
I was in a position.
Tell us what the bungee is.
Oh yes, let me back up.
Most of us don't do bungees.
So bungee is a temporary assignment. So some companies will do them. Typically, in larger companies, I have found will offer opportunities where, you know, if you're exceeding your expectations and meeting all of your goals and so forth, that you have the opportunity to work in a different role on a different team for a period of time. The goal is that there might be an opportunity at the end of it to transition into that role, or if not, go back to your team, but your spot as far as like your role is secure with the company. So I really, really wanted to do a bungee for the DEI team where and in program managing specifically, because I had done a lot of volunteer work with those teams. And so there were a lot of times where I was raising my hand and say, hey, let me help organize an event. Let me help, figure out how we can incorporate DEI into how we're hiring and, some of those best practices. So I had built up some really great rapport with the overall team that of program managers that were overseeing the DEI aspect of the business. And so there was an opportunity that opened up where I would have been able to go, and I did go, to work with that team as a DEI program manager. And at that time, there was kind of a little bit of a tip where I reached out to my manager and said, hey, this bungee is available. I would really love to do this. I have been keeping the person looped in on like what I've been doing with that team. So week over week, I would talk about what I was doing in recruiting, but what I was also doing volunteering, because I think it's important, part of advocacy and self-promotion. You need to make sure you're letting your manager know what you're doing. So I was being that person in week over week and saying, this is what I'm working on. Here's, the areas that I'm really passionate about. Here's our areas that I might want to explore. So when that opportunity opened, I reached out and said, hey, there's an opportunity to do this. I would love to be able to do this right now. And given that at that time with recruiting, there was a lot of hold and pause because they were doing restructures within the organization, I said, this could be a great time to take that opportunity to move over. So initially I was told no, that realistically that was not going to happen, that there was like a slim to none chance for me to be able to go into that role, and was told I should probably just not even try to go for it. And I, at that point, was like, no. In my mind, I was going back and forth because I was like, this doesn't make sense, because especially there was somebody else within the team that had the same opportunity that I did for a different type of bungee, and they got the approval. And this had just happened about maybe 2 weeks prior to me asking to make that same move. And so in that moment, I'm like, okay, I have two options. I can either just let this go.
Yeah.
And, just sit back in my seat and let it ride. Knowing that I was going to be really upset about it, right? Internally, I was going to, it would have really put a bad taste in my mouth. And that would have been on me if I didn't speak up for myself. Then I went back and I was like, no, I'm going to advocate for myself. And regardless of the outcome of this, the fact that I'm advocating for myself, which is something that I typically don't or hadn't done in previous times, just because I was like, I'm not the person to ruffle feathers. I'm not the person I'm the yes person, right? Like that's how I've typically been historically. But this,
and you have to build enough capital within an organization to feel confident and safe doing it. And if you, when you first start out at a company, it's not really the time where you get to, at least
Right.
earlier on in your career, or if you've pivoted into a field, yeah, it takes time. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, you're good. But that's a good call out, and so like timing does play a factor. I think to your point, you have to, build, that, to your point, that capital where you've established your mark, like you've shown up for yourself. And so in this case, I felt that I was like, look, I've been here, I've exceeded expectations. I've done, a lot of work above and beyond my role. And this is something I really want for myself as part of my professional growth and development. And this is impactful to the business because the learnings that I can gain from being in this role, I can bring back to recruiting. So I built up this whole proposal and I shared it with my manager. And then I also shared it with my skip level, and just highlighting essentially how the work that I was doing by volunteering was already impacting the team in a positive way. So I was able to tie it back to the team, to the business, and advocate for how going into this role and being able to continue to learn, I could come back and I would be able to add so much more value, because in recruiting, one of the critical pieces in recruiting is how do we bring in talent from underrepresented backgrounds, right? And how do we make sure we build a community and environment that is more diverse and inclusive? Well, if you have me in a position where I'm learning more of the ins and outs of how, we do this, how we hire, how we can really have an impact and bring that back to the team, then I'm actually, helping the team as a whole in that case. So that was the argument that I proposed, and then ultimately had that conversation with both my manager and skip level.
And how did it go?
It actually went well in the sense, apologize for noise in the background.
You got some construction going on at your place.
I'm like, goodness gracious.
We'll roll with it. Things got to happen when they got to happen.
I'm like, perfect timing to show up. But
we'll take the repairs whenever we can get them. I'm all for that. We're not gonna move this for that.
No, but thank you for understanding. But yeah, I went to both of them, and then ultimately they shot it up the ladder and they said, okay, you want this? All right. You've sold yourself on, you sold your case. We're going to go ahead and we'll shoot this up the ladder to get the approval. I got the approval and I was able to make the move.
Well, I would have been blown away as a manager to have somebody come with a proposal already demonstrating the impact and the value that they have made and that they can make, directly kind of connecting the dots there. I mean, if someone's willing to advocate for themselves and wants to do this work that badly, why wouldn't I give them the opportunity?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that was my thought process and my hope that was the way they were going to see it. But you never know. So
true. You never know exactly how that might be perceived. And I was going to ask you, since you have the DEI background, I'd love to, come at self-promotion with the lens of DEI and how, people of different backgrounds are perceived when they self-promote. Because I imagine that it's perceived differently depending on who you're promoting to. And, in a perfect world, that wouldn't be the case. But I can imagine just from my own experiences that there's been times where it's been harder to self-promote as a woman versus my male colleagues. And I can imagine with other backgrounds and identities as well, that they play a factor, whether we want them to or not. So I don't know if you've seen that in your career or can speak to that at all from a DEI lens of, how that impacts self-promotion.
Yeah, I think to your point, one of the things that I learned going really into the data was that there is a really big gap when you think about self-promotion and those that are getting promoted. I might have to move. I'm sorry.
You're good. Take your time. You can move.
Okay.
You move and I can always chit chat. This is what going live is all about.
I was like, yeah, this is live at its finest. So.
This is real life. This is real people coming together on a podcast. It's totally fine. I've been there with the construction. You've got to get it fixed. You have is it pipes or something? It sounds like a plumbing issue.
Yeah, it's definitely plumbing that we have going on. So I'm trying to move to a space where you guys will be able to hear me now. So
yeah.
But you get my whole entire house. So thank you.
Hey, this is a house tour. Let's change this to an HGTV episode.
But hopefully I'm going to sit outside for a second.
Yeah, it sounds great.
That will hopefully help us. Okay, so hopefully this is good. Can you hear me okay?
I can. There's a little bit of wind. You sounded pretty good in that area right before you exited your house. I don't know if you want to go back into that.
Okay. Yeah.
Nope.
So
No, that sounds good.
that's good. Okay, perfect. So thank you all for bearing with me here. But as far as the data, so I was talking about the fact that one of the things that was mind blowing to me, and I don't know why, maybe, I guess because I had never had the opportunity to see behind the scenes, but there was such a gap when we look at the number of people that are getting promoted, how they're being evaluated, when we look at women versus men, when we look at different backgrounds, there's a disparity. And so
Yeah.
for me, that was mind blowing, because what that shows me is that people either are not being equipped maybe with the right resources, or there's not enough training to really help our management team and leadership understand how to have these conversations. And when we think about people from different backgrounds and communities, like the way we communicate with one another might need to be tailored, right, based on who you're talking to and understanding the nuances that come with being in a position like that. So that's something that I think is, here we go again. We have, yeah,
So cute.
I know. So I'm on a podcast right now, and then there's my dogs coming. But yeah, so those were some of the things for me that I really saw that stood out to me, that I was just like, there's a lot of work to be done. And I really think that there's so much that people just don't understand. And I really wish that people could see behind the scenes more, because when we think about women, for example, a lot of times, we've had surveys that we've looked at where women have reported that they don't feel like they can have conversations and
Yeah.
they can speak up, and they feel like they have a safe place to do so. So when we think about self-promotion and advocacy and people that are moving and climbing, well, that doesn't foster an environment that allows for people to be able to progress, specifically in the case of like women, or thinking about even like Black Plus, like that was, a bucket that, where there was a lot of work that needed to be addressed, in the sense that the Black Plus community was getting promoted at a much lower rate than other populations. So why is that? So when we think about the self-advocacy piece, well, what is it that's going on in the environment that they're in that is not allowing for people to, really thrive in the environments that they're in?
Yeah. I think there's a lot about perception and how managers perceive, and there's always constant implicit bias. And if you are not trained to, check your implicit bias,
Yep.
I think as a manager, you're going to continue to act on your implicit bias without realizing it. And that's going to create, either at an organizational level or at least your line level, if we're talking about organizational structure, you're going to create an environment where you aren't hearing people fully when they do self-promote, or then eventually they're not going to feel comfortable to self-promote at all. And it creates these data results that you're talking about, where people of color or women are getting promoted at much lower disproportionate level. So I think if for managers listening, you have to constantly just be aware of how you perceive people and take some time to reflect on that. Like, how did I perceive when this person, came to me about this issue? Is there anything working where I had biased reactions based on my own experiences, where, maybe I need to come at, putting myself in their shoes? So I think it's a constant battle for people.
Yeah, agree. I think you're spot on with that. I think it really, the awareness and the education piece is huge.
Yeah.
And I think that takes all of us, though. Like it's all of our responsibility. So especially if you're in a position of leadership, like you need to really be taking that seriously, because this is impacting, right, the livelihoods of people. This is impacting, the organization. And when we talk about retention and wanting to build these communities, these organizations that are diverse and building inclusivity, bringing people in with different perspectives, well, what are we doing to make sure that we can do that within our company, right? And so I really am a big advocate for the education piece and prioritizing that, because sometimes I think it can be an afterthought, because there's a lot going on and we think about productivity, but it really needs to be a priority where we are coming to the table, having these conversations like this, where we're able to really just dive in and understand how we can play a part in a positive impact and change that we really need to start seeing.
Yeah, it's why having dedicated DEI efforts is so important, because if it is an afterthought, it is going to fall to the wayside. You have to have people dedicated to doing this work in order for that education, that awareness to happen. Because yeah, it doesn't happen overnight, and it's not a snap your fingers kind of understand it and move forward kind of thing. I'm keeping an eye on time and want to make sure that we get to ask you the final question that I ask all my podcast guests, which is, when or where have you felt most empowered as a woman?
When and where?
Honestly, yeah, when or where, could be either.
When or where. Yeah. So I think for me, where I felt most empowered within an organization specifically was when I was working at Google, and they have a lot of ERG groups, so employee resource groups. There is a big community dedicated to women. And for me, that was very eye-opening, because prior to that environment, I hadn't seen how powerful it is when women come together and advocate for one another and mentor one another. And like that sort of community was beautiful to just be part of, because then it was like, with the struggles that I was experiencing, I was able to talk to other women about it, and I was able to understand, in the environment that I was in, how can I, show up, and how can I advocate for myself, and how can I really thrive in this environment, knowing that like there's a lot to consider, right? And when you're in an environment where you have to produce, and you have to make sure that you're operating at such a high level, sometimes like you can get lost in the sea of everything that's going on.
Yeah.
You feel like you're on this little island by yourself. So for me, that was really powerful to be part of that. But then that also prompted me to seek out other communities similar, even outside of the company, to identify other opportunities to start connecting with women, where I can, help empower others. And, same thing for me, like others can pour into me, and vice versa, I can pour into other women, because I think helping women understand, and us learning from one another also is powerful, in the sense of that allows us to grow. Like, what worked for me may work for you, or what can I learn, so I don't make that same, not necessarily mistake, but so I don't do maybe the same thing, and I can save myself time and heartache and so forth. So I think that for me was the moment where I felt most empowered.
Yeah, I love that. And the employee resource groups are hugely important. And I know not every organization has them. Some aren't large enough to have that or support that. But I think you make a great plug for taking advantage of those if your organization offers them. And if your organization doesn't, but you think that you would have the people who would want them, I think starting them is certainly a great idea when it comes to recruitment and retention. So I'm glad you brought that up. And I appreciate you sharing your stories with us today, and your background, and your pivot into tech, and your stories of self-promotion, I think, speak to the power of it. And it's also a honed skill that you have. I mean, your story speaks to your ability to self-promote into a new industry. And so I think there's a lot to be taken away from that. And we didn't have the time, but I wanted to ask you about how you self-promoted in the resume and application stage to even land that interview with Indeed, because that's a whole nother process, as a lot of job seekers today can't even break through that door to get the interview. So we may need to have an offline or a second conversation about that, because that is a huge hurdle that people are facing right now, is how do I even, if no one's even reading my resume, or, I can't even get face-to-face conversations to get to self-promote for myself. How do I do that at the application stage? And I don't know that I have a perfect answer, but we can definitely have a conversation around it.
Yeah, I definitely will take you up on that. I think that's a really important conversation to have, because to your point, there seems like for a lot of people, it feels like there's such a big barrier to entry right now, just even in that part, the resume, the application, and then it actually being seen, and you then be able to go in and have a conversation with somebody about your experience. So I would love to have that conversation. Yeah.
Let's do it. We'll follow up, and we'll do a session for folks. But I appreciate your time today, Erica. It's been great to chat with you. If anybody wants to reach out to us and continue this conversation, you can find us both on LinkedIn. And, we're happy to chat with anybody about this. But thanks for tuning in, guys. It's good to see everybody. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, Sloan. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.